December 1941. A German panzer column sits frozen in the snow outside Moscow. Engines won't start. Weapons won't fire. The temperature has plunged to -40. Every documentary tells you the same story. General Winter saved Moscow. The Russian cold defeated Hitler. It's a lie. What actually stopped the Wehrmacht wasn't snowflakes. It was steel, blood, and a logistics miracle no one talks about. While the Germans were still advancing in August, the Soviets were already moving their entire industrial civilization 2,000 kilometers east. 16 million people, 1,500 factories, dismantled piece by piece, while artillery shells landed in the courtyards. They reassembled those factories in the middle of nowhere and outproduced the Reich. But the cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of workers who never saw their families again. To understand how, we need to go back to June 1941, when everything was on fire. June 22nd, 1941. 3 million men crossed the Soviet border. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. German confidence was absolute. Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, wrote in his diary on July 3rd, "It is not too much to say the campaign against Russia has been won in 14 days. He had reason to believe it. The Soviet collapse was total. 600,000 prisoners in the first 3 weeks. Entire armies encircled at Minsk and Smolensk. Stalin disappeared for days after the invasion. His NKVD chiefs found him at his dacha, sitting in silence, apparently expecting a rest." The arithmetic of annihilation was brutal. By September, the Soviets had lost 20,000 tanks and 4,000 aircraft, more than Germany's entire starting force. The Panzers were racing toward Moscow. Victory seemed certain. But German quartermaster reports from August told a different story. Supply lines already stretched to breaking. 30% of trucks broken down. Horses dying faster than they could be replaced. The German war machine was grinding itself apart on the vast distances of Russia. Then came the shock. German intelligence had expected 200 Soviet divisions. By August, they'd identified 360. Halder called them ghost armies. Where were they coming from? The answer was already moving east on 1.5 million rail cars. Stalin's State Defense Committee issued Order No. 99 in August 1941. Evacuate all industrial capacity from threatened zones. 1,500 factories. 16 million people. The entire industrial base of European Russia had to be torn apart and moved before the Germans arrived. The chaos was absolute. Factories were dismantled while German artillery shells landed in the courtyards. At Kharkov in September, factory number 183, the plant that built the T-34 tank, was torn apart piece by piece as Panzers closed to within 50 kilometers. Workers were given 24 hours notice. 1 suitcase. No guarantees their families could follow. The journey was a nightmare. Open flat cars in freezing rain. 3-week trips that should take 3 days. Children died of exposure. Railway workers kept the trains moving under Luftwaffe bombardment. 100,000 of them died. The numbers are staggering. 2,593 enterprises moved, including 1,523 major factories. The equivalent of moving all of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Gary, Indiana, simultaneously. The destination was worse than the journey. The Urals, Kazakhstan, Siberia. Places with no infrastructure, no housing, often just empty steppe. What they found when they arrived would test the limits of human endurance, but it would also forge the weapon that would break the Wehrmacht. The factories had to start producing immediately. Stalin's orders were clear. Resume production by year's end, or the war is lost. The workforce was whoever could lift a wrench. Women, teenagers, some as young as 14. The elderly. They would work 12-hour shifts in open air in -40-degree cold, assembling tanks in the snow. For every 100 tanks they produced, 3 workers died from exposure, malnutrition, or accidents. But they kept producing, because the alternative was German occupation. And everyone knew what that meant. By December, the first T-34s were rolling off the line at Nizhny Tagil. Assembled in the open air, snow falling on the engine blocks, the Soviet industrial miracle had begun. But the human cost was only starting to mount. The scale of what the Soviets attempted in the summer and fall of 1941 defies comprehension. This wasn't an orderly industrial relocation. It was a desperate race against annihilation. GKO Order Number 99, issued in August 1941, set the terms. Evacuate all industrial capacity from threatened zones. 1,500 factories, 16 million people. Everything that could be moved had to go east before the Germans arrived. The chaos was immediate. At Kharkov, factory number 183, the plant that produced the T-34 tank, became a case study in controlled panic. German Panzers were closing in. Artillery fire could be heard in the distance. Engineers worked around the clock to dismantle the massive production lines. Every lathe, every press, every piece of machinery was numbered and catalogued. Workers dismantled equipment they'd spent years learning to operate, knowing they might never see it again. The factory that had produced hundreds of tanks was reduced to components loaded onto rail cars. The human element was brutal. Workers received 24 hours notice, 1 suitcase per person. Families were often separated, husbands at the front, wives and children evacuated separately. There were no guarantees anyone would survive the journey, let alone be reunited. The railway system became the lifeline of Soviet survival. Trains moved east in an endless stream, often under Luftwaffe bombardment. Railway workers kept the lines operating despite constant air attacks. Many worked until they collapsed. Over 100,000 railway workers died, keeping the evacuation moving. The journey itself was an ordeal. Flat cars loaded with machinery, passenger cars crammed with workers and their families. 3-week journeys that should have taken 3 days. Food was scarce. Water often froze. Children died of exposure on the open cars. One woman who survived the evacuation later recalled, "We left Leningrad with 200 people in our factory group. 43 died on the train. We buried them beside the tracks and kept moving." The numbers tell part of the story. 2,593 enterprises were moved in total. This included 1,523 major factories, the industrial heart of the Soviet Union. It was the equivalent of simultaneously relocating every major manufacturing center in the American Midwest. But statistics can't capture what it meant. Entire cities were being emptied. The Kirov tank plant in Leningrad was dismantled and moved to Chelyabinsk. The Zaporozhstal steelworks went to Magnitogorsk. Aircraft factories, munitions plants, machine tool works, all torn apart and shipped east. The destination was often worse than the journey: the Urals, Kazakhstan, Western Siberia. These were remote regions with minimal infrastructure. Many evacuated factories arrived at sites that were literally empty steppe. No buildings, no housing, often no roads. Workers stepped off the trains into wilderness. Their first task was survival. They dug dugouts in the frozen ground for shelter. They slept in railway cars. Some factories began production before walls were built, assembling weapons in the open air as winter approached. The pressure was immense. Stalin's orders were explicit. Production must resume immediately. The Red Army was being destroyed at the front. Every day without new tanks, new guns, new ammunition brought the Germans closer to victory. So they worked. In conditions that would have shut down any Western factory, Soviet workers began reassembling the industrial base. Machinery was installed in unheated buildings. Workers operated lathes while wearing every piece of clothing they owned. The human cost began mounting immediately. Frostbite was epidemic. Malnutrition became the norm. Accidents killed workers who were too exhausted to be careful around heavy machinery. But the alternative was unthinkable. Everyone knew what German occupation meant. The choice was stark: produce or die. So they produced. By December 1941, as German forces stalled outside Moscow, the evacuated factories were beginning to come online. The industrial miracle was taking shape, but it was being paid for in human lives at a rate that would have been unacceptable in any other circumstance. The evacuation wasn't just a logistical achievement. It was a national trauma that would shape Soviet society for generations. Magnitogorsk, the Iron Mountain. Built in the 1930s in the southern Urals, it was already the Soviet Union's largest steel complex when the evacuation began. Now, it would have to do the impossible: match the output of Germany's entire Ruhr Valley with a fraction of the workforce. The city sat on one of the richest iron ore deposits in the world. Stalin had built it as a showcase of Soviet industrial might. American engineers had designed the original blast furnaces. In peacetime, it had been a symbol of progress. In war, it became a forge of human suffering. As evacuated factories arrived from the west, Magnitogorsk absorbed them. The Kharkov steelworks, the Leningrad metallurgical plants. Equipment was installed wherever space could be found. New blast furnaces were built in weeks instead of years. The workforce was whoever remained. By 1942, women made up the majority of workers. Teenagers as young as 14 operated machinery designed for grown men. The elderly worked alongside them. Anyone who could lift a wrench was put to work. The conditions were medieval. Blast furnaces operated in open air during winter. Temperatures inside the plant could swing from -40 Celsius outside to over 1,000 degrees near the furnaces. Workers wrapped their hands in rags soaked in kerosene to prevent frostbite. Protective equipment was non-existent. Shifts ran 12 to 14 hours, 7 days a week. There were no holidays, no breaks except for the briefest meal. Sleep happened on the factory floor when exhaustion made it impossible to continue. Frostbite was so common it became routine. Workers would lose fingers to the cold, have them bandaged, and return to work the same day. The alternative was starvation. Factory workers received 800 grams of bread per day, if supplies arrived. Non-workers received 400 grams. The choice was simple: work or starve. The production race was existential. Magnitogorsk had to match the Ruhr Valley's steel output, Germany's industrial heartland, untouched by war, with its experienced workforce and established infrastructure. Magnitogorsk had teenagers and women working in the snow. Somehow, they did it. By 1942, Magnitogorsk was producing more steel than all of Britain. The numbers are almost impossible to believe. 45% of Soviet tank armor came from this single complex. Every T-34 that broke through German lines at Kursk was forged here. But the human cost was staggering. The mortality rate among workers was classified, and remains so to this day. What we know comes from declassified accounts from the 1990s. One woman who worked at Magnitogorsk remembered, "We slept on the factory floor. 3 girls in my section died that winter. We kept working. What else could we do?" Accidents were constant. Exhausted workers handling molten steel made fatal mistakes. The official records don't exist, but survivor accounts suggest that for every 100 tons of steel produced, at least 1 worker died. The Soviet government never acknowledged this sacrifice. After the war, Magnitogorsk workers received medals in recognition for their production achievements. But the thousands who died there were never counted, never memorialized. They were simply the price of victory. The steel kept flowing, month after month, year after year. The blast furnaces never stopped. By 1943, Magnitogorsk was producing more steel than it had in peacetime, despite losing much of its experienced workforce to the front. This was the Soviet industrial miracle, not efficient, not humane, but effective. The steel that stopped the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad, that broke through at Kursk, that eventually rolled into Berlin, it was all forged here, paid for in lives no one bothered to count. Nizhny Tagil, December 1941. A small industrial town in the Urals, 2,000 kilometers east of Kharkov. This is where factory number 183 arrived in pieces, after its desperate evacuation. The factory that had produced the T-34, the tank that would ultimately decide the war, now sat in crates and on flat cars in the middle of winter. The local Uralmashzavod plant, which normally produced rail cars, was ordered to absorb it. 2 factories would become one, with a single mission: resume T-34 production immediately. Stalin's order was explicit. T-34 production must restart by year's end, or the war is lost. The timeline was impossible. It was early December. That gave them less than a month. The reality on the ground was worse than anyone imagined. There was no roof, no walls. Machinery sat in the snow. Workers had no housing. They slept in dugouts they'd carved into the frozen earth. Temperatures were already dropping below -30. But the order was clear. So they began. Engineers worked around the clock to reassemble production lines they dismantled weeks earlier. The problem was that many of the workers who'd made the journey were sick, injured, or dead. New workers had to be trained on the spot. Teenagers and women who'd never seen a lathe before were now expected to build tanks. The first challenge was simply getting the machinery operational in sub-zero temperatures. Metal became brittle. Lubricants froze. Welding equipment malfunctioned. Every technical problem that could arise did arise, all at once, in the worst possible conditions. December 8th, 1941. The first T-34 rolled off the line. assembled in open air, snow falling on the engine block. Workers wearing every piece of clothing they owned. It was crude, barely functional, but it was a tank, and it proved the impossible was possible. Production accelerated rapidly. By mid-1942, factory number 183 was producing one T-34 every 30 minutes. Faster than any German tank plant. The secret wasn't efficiency. It was desperation and an endless supply of workers willing to die to make it happen. Quality suffered. Early Urals T-34s had rough welds. Transmissions were unreliable. Engines often failed after a few hundred kilometers, but there were thousands of them. The Soviet strategy was simple: quantity over quality. Build 10 tanks knowing 5 would break down. The other 5 would still outnumber German armor. The human cost was brutal. For every 100 tanks produced, 3 workers died from exposure, malnutrition, or accidents. Frostbite was epidemic. Workers operated welding equipment with frozen fingers. Accidents with molten metal killed dozens. One survivor later described the scene. "We worked until we couldn't stand. Then we slept on the factory floor for a few hours and started again." People died next to their workstations. We pulled them aside and kept working. The German perspective reveals the impact. Heinz Guderian, the Panzer general who'd led the initial thrust into Russia, wrote in his memoir, "We destroyed their tank army in June. By November, they had more tanks than when we started. It was incomprehensible." By the time of Stalingrad in late 1942, the Soviets fielded 1,500 T-34s. Germany had 600 total tanks on the entire Eastern Front. The production race was over. The Soviets had won. But tanks need fuel to move and ammunition to fight. Steel alone doesn't win wars. The Soviets were building the sword, but they needed someone else to provide the arm that would swing it. That help was coming from an unexpected direction. Across the Arctic Ocean, through some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. August 1941. The first British convoy departed for Archangel. 7 merchant ships carrying 15,000 tons of supplies. It was the beginning of a lifeline that would keep the Soviet Union in the war. But we need to be clear about what Lend-Lease actually provided. The popular narrative suggests the West won the war for the Soviets. The Soviet narrative claims they did it alone. Both are wrong. Here's the reality. The Soviets built 90% of their own tanks and artillery. The steel, the guns, the fighting vehicles. That was Soviet production. But they couldn't move those tanks without Western trucks. They couldn't fly their aircraft without Western fuel. And they couldn't feed their armies without Western food. The numbers tell the story. 400,000 Studebaker trucks, 1,900 locomotives, 11,000 rail cars. This was the logistics backbone of the Red Army. Without it, all those T-34s would have sat immobile at the factory gates. Aviation fuel was even more critical. 50% of Soviet high-octane fuel came through Lend-Lease. Without it, the VVS, the Soviet Air Force, couldn't fly. Those IL-2 Sturmovix that terrorized German positions. Half their fuel came from American refineries. Food kept the Red Army fed. 4.5 million tons of provisions arrived via Lend-Lease. enough to feed the entire Red Army for a year. This freed Soviet agriculture to focus on the front lines and allowed factory workers to receive their 800-gram bread rations. But getting these supplies to the Soviet Union was a nightmare. The Arctic convoys had to navigate some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. U-boats prowled the North Atlantic. The Luftwaffe attacked from Norwegian bases. And the Arctic weather could sink a ship as easily as a torpedo. PQ-17 in July 1942 became the worst disaster. 35 merchant ships set out. 24 were sunk by U-boats and German aircraft. 3,350 vehicles lost. 430 tanks. 210 aircraft, all at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. The human cost was staggering. Merchant sailors froze to death in minutes if their ships went down. Survival time in Arctic water was measured in seconds. Entire crews vanished without a trace. Yet the convoys kept coming, month after month, year after year. By 1943, 22% of Soviet war material was arriving via Murmansk. The Germans had assumed the Allies wouldn't risk the Arctic route. They were wrong. The Soviet response to this aid was complicated. Khrushchev later admitted, "Without Lend-Lease, we would have lost the war." But Stalin publicly downplayed Western help. He needed to maintain the narrative of Soviet self-sufficiency for domestic propaganda. The truth is more nuanced. The Soviets built the sword, the tanks, guns, and artillery that broke the Wehrmacht. But the Allies provided the arm that swung it, the trucks, fuel, and food that kept the Red Army mobile and fighting. This wasn't charity. It was strategic necessity. If the Soviet Union fell, Hitler would control the resources of an entire continent. The Western Allies needed the Soviets in the war as much as the Soviets needed Western supplies. By early 1943, the industrial balance had shifted decisively. Soviet factories were now producing at rates that exceeded German output. Lend-Lease was flowing steadily, despite losses. The Wehrmacht was being ground down by a combination of Soviet steel and Allied logistics. But the real miracle wasn't the ships or the supplies. It was what the Soviets did with them. Uralmashzavod, the giant. Before the war, it was the Soviet Union's largest heavy machinery plant, producing mining equipment and industrial presses. By 1942, it had been transformed into something else entirely, the heart of Soviet heavy artillery production. The pivot happened fast. As evacuated factories arrived, Uralmash absorbed them and retooled for war. Mining equipment production stopped. In its place, self-propelled guns, heavy artillery, tank destroyers. Everything the Red Army needed to break through German fortifications. The Su-152, Beast Killer, became Uralmash's signature weapon. A massive 152mm gun mounted on a KV-1 tank chassis. It was designed and put into production in 25 days. From blueprint to battlefield in under a month. German Tiger tanks that had seemed invincible suddenly had a predator. The workforce transformation was equally dramatic. By 1943, women made up 70% of Uralmash workers. Many had been trained in weeks to operate lathes and presses that took German workers years to master. They weren't as skilled, but they were fast, and there were thousands of them. innovation came from desperation. Uralmash engineers simplified every design they could. Fewer parts meant faster assembly. Rougher tolerances meant less precision work. The goal wasn't perfection. It was good enough to kill a Tiger tank. And it worked. The human cost mounted steadily. Accident rates soared as exhausted workers handled molten steel and high explosives. One engineer's diary, declassified decades later, captured the calculus. We knew every SPG we built meant 10 Germans dead. We also knew every week of delay meant 1,000 Russians dead. The math was simple. That math drove everything. Sleep was a luxury. Safety was secondary. The only metric that mattered was production. How many guns today? How many tomorrow? Could we do more? The output was staggering. 2,500 Su-152s, 1,500 ISU-122s. Enough heavy self-propelled guns to form the backbone of Soviet breakthrough operations in 1944 and 1945. When Soviet forces smashed through German lines in Operation Bagration, Uralmash weapons led the way. But the real innovation wasn't the weapons themselves. It was the production system. Uralmash became a model for other Soviet factories. Simplified designs, rapid training, acceptance of casualties as a cost of production. It was brutal, but it worked. The contrast with German production was stark. German factories still prioritized quality over quantity. Each Panther tank was a masterpiece of engineering, requiring skilled workers and precision manufacturing. It took weeks to build one. Uralmash could produce 3 Su-152s in the same time. They were cruder, less reliable, but there were 3 of them, and in a war of attrition, numbers win. By late 1943, the production race was over. Soviet factories were churning out weapons faster than Germany could replace losses. The Wehrmacht was being buried under an avalanche of Soviet steel. But the greatest sacrifice wasn't happening in the factories. It was happening in the territories the Germans had already conquered, where Stalin's scorched earth policy was claiming Soviet lives by the hundreds of thousands. September 1941. As German forces closed on the Dnieper River, Stalin faced an impossible choice. The Dnieper hydroelectric station, Dnipro-GES, was the largest dam in Europe, a symbol of Soviet industrial progress built in the 1930s with American engineering help. Now it had to be destroyed. The dilemma was brutal. Blow it up to deny the Germans power for their advance, or leave it intact and risk fueling the Wehrmacht's war machine. Stalin's answer came without hesitation. Destroy it. NKVD engineers rigged 20 tons of explosives throughout the dam structure. They worked through the night of August 17th. At dawn, on August 18th, the charges detonated. What happened next was catastrophe on a scale that still isn't fully documented. The massive flood wave roared downstream, drowning thousands of Soviet civilians and retreating Red Army troops. Entire villages vanished. The exact death toll remains classified to this day, but estimates range from several thousand to tens of thousands. The justification was cold arithmetic. Better our people die than the Germans use our power to kill more of our people. It was total war reduced to its most brutal logic. Every resource denied to the enemy was worth any price in Soviet lives. German reaction revealed the psychological impact. Captured documents show Wehrmacht engineers were stunned. One report noted, "They destroyed their own people to stop us. The level of fanaticism is beyond anything we anticipated." But the Dnieper Dam was just the beginning. Stalin's scorched earth policy extended across the entire front. Nothing of value could fall into German hands intact. If it couldn't be evacuated, it had to be destroyed. The numbers are staggering. 70,000 villages burned by Soviet forces during the retreat. 100,000 collective farms destroyed. 1,700 towns razed. This wasn't German destruction. This was Soviet policy. The human cost was immense. Millions of Soviet citizens were left homeless, starving, or dead. Not from German action, but from Soviet scorched earth. Families who'd survived the German advance now faced death from their own government's strategy. The policy had military logic. The Germans were advancing faster than anyone anticipated. Every factory, every power station, every grain elevator they captured extended their logistical reach. Denying them resources slowed their advance and forced them to bring everything from Germany. But the moral cost was devastating. Soviet citizens watched their own government destroy everything they'd built. Homes burned, crops torched in the fields, livestock slaughtered rather than left for German use. The message was clear. The state's survival mattered more than any individual life. The Germans never fully restored the Dnieper Dam. They tried, but partisan attacks and resource shortages prevented it. The hydroelectric station that had powered much of Ukraine remained a ruin throughout the occupation. Stalin's gamble had worked. The Germans lost a major logistical hub. But the broader scorched earth policy created a humanitarian catastrophe. The Soviet Union was destroying itself to deny resources to the invader. It was a strategy born of desperation, executed with ruthless efficiency, and paid for in civilian lives. This was the price of buying time for the evacuated factories to start producing. Every village burned, every dam destroyed, every civilian who starved. It all bought days and weeks for the Urals factories to come online. By December 1941, as those first T-34s rolled off the assembly lines at Nizhny Tagil, the scorched earth policy had achieved its goal. The German advance had slowed. Their logistics were collapsing, and the Soviet industrial base was beginning to produce the weapons that would turn the tide. But the human cost of that achievement would haunt the Soviet Union for generations. December 1941. German army group center grinds to a halt 20 kilometers from Moscow. Temperatures plunge to -40 Celsius. Soldiers freeze in their summer uniforms. Tank engines won't start. Weapons jam in the cold. Every documentary tells you this is when General Winter saved the Soviets. The Russian cold defeated Hitler where the Red Army couldn't. But that's not what the German records show. Franz Halder's diary entry from August 11th, 1941, 4 months before the first snowfall, tells a different story. We have underestimated the Russian colossus. The whole situation makes it increasingly plain that we have underestimated the Russian colossus. At the start of the war, we reckoned with about 200 enemy divisions. Now, we have already counted 360. The German quartermaster reports from September paint an even bleaker picture. 30% of trucks non-operational. Horses dying at a rate of 1,000 per day. Ammunition shortages at the front. The German logistics system was collapsing before winter even arrived. The myth of General Winter lets Germany off the hook. It suggests they were winning until nature intervened. The reality is they were already losing in the summer heat. The Soviet counteroffensive launched on December 5th and 6th wasn't a miracle of winter warfare. It was the result of careful planning. Stalin had finally received intelligence from his spy, Richard Scorched, in Tokyo. Japan would not attack the Soviet Far East. Immediately he began transferring divisions from Siberia. 1 million fresh troops arrived at Moscow. Not because of winter, but because Stalin could finally move them west. These were experienced soldiers, many trained specifically for winter combat. They had proper equipment, white camouflage, weapons that functioned in the cold. The Germans, meanwhile, were exhausted. They'd been fighting continuously since June. Their supply lines stretched over 1,000 kilometers. Every gallon of fuel, every bullet, every piece of food had to travel that distance before reaching the front. Heinz Guderian, the Panzer general, admitted as much in his memoir. The Russian winter was no worse than ours in Poland or France. What broke us was the endless reserves. We'd destroy an army, and another would appear. We'd capture 300,000 prisoners and face 400,000 fresh troops the next week. The numbers confirm it. By December, the Soviets had rebuilt 300 divisions. Germany had destroyed 360 by August, yet they kept coming. This wasn't weather. This was industrial capacity. Those 1,500 evacuated factories were now producing 600 tanks per month. Germany was producing 250. The production race was already over, even if the fighting would continue for years. The winter bought time, certainly. It slowed German operations and gave the Soviets breathing room. But it didn't save Moscow. What saved Moscow was the industrial miracle happening 2,000 kilometers to the east. Every T-34 rolling off the line at Nizhny Tagil, every artillery piece from Uralmash, every ton of steel from Magnitogorsk. That's what stopped the Wehrmacht. Steel, not snow. The myth persists because it's simpler. Easier to blame the weather than admit the Soviets outproduced, outfought, and outsuffered the Wehrmacht. Easier to say General Winter than acknowledge that millions of Soviet workers died building the weapons that won the war. But the German generals knew the truth. When they wrote their memoirs after the war, they blamed the winter because it was better than admitting they'd been beaten by an enemy they'd dismissed as subhuman. Better to lose to nature than to Soviet industrial might. The winter was real. The suffering was real. But it was a symptom, not the cause. The German war machine was already broken. The cold just made it visible. The arithmetic of Soviet survival defies easy comprehension. In 1942, despite losing 40% of its population and 60% of its pre-war industrial capacity to German occupation, Soviet industrial output exceeded 1940 levels. How is that possible? The answer lies in what was sacrificed to achieve it. The workforce transformation was total. Women made up 55% of factory workers by 1943, compared to 38% in 1940. This wasn't Rosie the Riveter with a lunch break and overtime pay. This was survival at its most desperate. Factory workers received 800 grams of bread per day, if supplies arrived on time. Non-workers received 400 grams. The message was explicit. Work or starve. There was no middle ground. Child labor became systematic. 15% of the wartime workforce was under 18. Some were as young as 12, operating lathes in 12-hour shifts. They weren't learning a trade. They were keeping the production lines moving because there was no one else. The mortality figures tell the real story, though exact numbers remain classified. Conservative estimates suggest 500,000 to 1 million workers died from malnutrition, exposure, and accidents in the evacuated factories alone. That's separate from combat deaths, separate from civilian casualties under occupation. This was the cost of production itself. The comparison is uncomfortable. German forced labor in the Reich killed 2.8 million people through deliberate brutality. Soviet voluntary labor in the Urals may have killed nearly as many of their own people through desperation and neglect. The difference was intent, not outcome. One survivor's account, recorded in a 1990s interview, captures the mindset. We knew we were dying, but we also knew every tank we built saved 10 soldiers at the front. We had no choice. If we stopped, the Germans would kill us all anyway. That calculation, 10 soldiers saved for every worker who died, became the moral framework. It wasn't discussed officially. It didn't need to be. Everyone understood the mathematics of survival. The psychological toll was immense. Post-Soviet studies revealed that PTSD rates among Urals factory workers rivaled those of frontline combat troops. They'd spent years watching co-workers die, knowing they might be next, unable to stop or even slow down. The sacrifice wasn't just in lives lost, it was in futures stolen. An entire generation of Soviet youth spent their formative years in factory hell instead of schools. Women who should have been raising families were operating blast furnaces. Children who should have been learning to read were assembling artillery shells. The long-term demographic impact was catastrophic. Birth rates collapsed. The cohort born between 1941 and 1945 was permanently smaller, creating ripples through Soviet society for decades. The missing generation would affect everything from military recruitment to economic productivity long after the war ended. Stalin never publicly honored the factory workers. Their sacrifice was classified, their stories buried in archives. The official narrative focused on heroic soldiers and brilliant generals. The workers who made victory possible were footnotes, if they were mentioned at all. After the war, some received medals. Most received nothing but the knowledge they'd survived. The dead weren't counted separately from general wartime casualties. They simply disappeared into the statistical void of Soviet losses in the Great Patriotic War. The human ledger of Soviet victory is written in these uncounted lives. Every T-34 that reached Stalingrad, every artillery shell fired at Kursk, every bullet that found a German soldier. All of it was paid for by workers whose names we'll never know, who died building weapons in the snow. November 1942. The Battle of Stalingrad reaches its climax. 300,000 German troops are surrounded in the city. The Soviet pincers have closed. But the question everyone's asking is, where did all these tanks come from? The answer is Nizhny Tagil, Magnitogorsk, Uralmash, the factories that didn't exist on German intelligence maps 6 months ago. Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive launched on November 19th. After a massive artillery barrage, T-34s and assault infantry burst through Romanian positions on the German northern flank. The Romanians, equipped with obsolete weapons and stretched thin, collapsed almost immediately. The next day, a second Soviet thrust hit the southern flank. Again, the defenders crumbled. By November 23rd, the pincers met west of Stalingrad. General Paulus and his entire Sixth Army were cut off. German commanders were stunned. Paulus's diary entry captures the disbelief. Where are they getting these tanks? We destroyed their industry 6 months ago. Intelligence said their production capacity was crippled. Intelligence was wrong. Catastrophically wrong. The Soviets fielded 1,500 tanks at Stalingrad. The Germans had 600 total on the entire Eastern Front. The production advantage wasn't marginal. It was overwhelming. For every German tank destroyed, 3 Soviet tanks were already rolling off assembly lines to replace it. This wasn't just about numbers. It was about logistics. Those 27,000 railcars of supplies delivered to the Stalingrad front in 60 days. That was the evacuated rail stock from 1941 paying dividends. The locomotives and railcars that had moved factories east were now moving ammunition and fuel west. The human cost at Stalingrad was staggering. 1.1 million Soviet casualties, dead, wounded, captured. The Germans lost 800,000 Axis troops. But here's the critical difference. The Soviets could replace their losses. The Germans couldn't. Every week, thousands of replacement troops arrived from Soviet training camps. Fresh divisions from the interior. New tank brigades equipped with vehicles that hadn't existed a year earlier. The factories were delivering not just weapons, but the capacity to sustain losses that would have destroyed any other army. The logistical triumph was unprecedented. Moving supplies to Stalingrad through partisan-infested territory, across damaged rail lines, in the middle of winter. It should have been impossible. But the evacuated factories had rebuilt the Soviet logistics system from scratch. New locomotives, new railcars, new trucks from Lend-Lease. All of it converged on Stalingrad. When Paulus finally surrendered on January 31st, 1943, over 100,000 German soldiers stumbled into captivity. Only 5,000 would ever return home. The Sixth Army, one of the Wehrmacht's elite formations, had been annihilated. But the real story wasn't the battle itself. It was what made the battle possible. Those factories in the Urals, producing tanks in the snow. Those workers dying of exposure while assembling artillery shells. That was the foundation of Soviet victory. After Stalingrad, Germany never regained the initiative on the Eastern Front. The industrial balance had shifted permanently. The Wehrmacht was now fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that could outproduce them 10-1. The factories had done their job. The steel forged in Magnitogorsk, the tanks assembled at Nizhny Tagil, the guns built at Uralmash, all of it had converged at Stalingrad to break the Wehrmacht's spine. The war would grind on for 2 more years. Millions more would die. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Soviet industrial miracle had delivered the weapon that would destroy Nazi Germany. While the Urals factories were producing the weapons, Another war was being fought in the territories Germany had already conquered. A war that strangled the Wehrmacht from within. Soviet partisans, 230,000 rails destroyed, 1,700 trains derailed. German logistics, already stretched to the breaking point, were being systematically shredded by guerrilla forces operating behind enemy lines. The partisan movement wasn't spontaneous resistance. By 1942, it had become a coordinated military operation. Partisan units were supplied by air from the Urals, portable radio sets, explosives, and weapons flown in under cover of darkness. Those same factories producing tanks were also producing the tools of guerrilla warfare. The equipment told the story of Soviet industrial reach. PPSH-41 submachine guns, produced at a rate of 3,000 per day by 1943. RGD-33 grenades from Uralmash. The partisans weren't fighting with captured weapons. They were armed by the same industrial system that was equipping the Red Army. The tactics were brutally effective. Partisans would blow up a stretch of track in an isolated area, wait for the next train to derail, machine gun the troop escort, blow up and burn the freight, destroy the locomotive, then melt back into the forests before German forces could respond. The scale of disruption was catastrophic for German operations. Army Group North was forced to route reinforcements 130 miles north to Pskov, then load them into trucks, of which they had insufficient numbers. The rail lines partisans had destroyed were the arteries of German logistics. Without them, the Wehrmacht was bleeding out. German reprisals were savage. 345,000 Soviet civilians were killed in anti-partisan operations. Villages burned, populations massacred. The Germans hoped terror would stop the resistance. Instead, it fed it. Every atrocity created more partisans. The economic impact extended beyond the railways. Peat extraction, used for electricity generation across northern Russia, almost ceased. Partisans made it too dangerous for work crews to operate. Timber cutting was curtailed. Crews wouldn't enter the forests. The Germans couldn't repair bridges or build fortifications because they couldn't get the materials. The psychological toll on German troops was immense. Soldiers never felt safe behind the lines. Convoys were ambushed, supply depots raided, communications cut. The rear area became as dangerous as the front. Morale collapsed as reinforcements took casualties 1,000 kilometers from the fighting. One German rear commander's report captured the desperation. Partisan activity has increased. The troops left to this command are sufficient to protect the most important installations. For anti-partisan operations, there are no longer any troops on hand. The partisan war was the invisible hand choking the Wehrmacht. While T-34s broke through at the front, partisans ensured German reinforcements never arrived. While Soviet artillery pounded German positions, partisans destroyed the ammunition trains that would have allowed the Germans to respond. This was total war in its purest form. Every Soviet citizen behind German lines became a potential weapon. Factory workers sabotaged production. Railway workers derailed trains. Farmers poisoned food supplies. The occupied territories became a nightmare for German occupation forces. By 1943, partisans controlled up to 50% of occupied Belorussia. Entire regions were effectively Soviet territory deep behind German lines. The Wehrmacht had conquered the cities, but lost the countryside. And in a war of logistics, controlling the countryside meant controlling the supply lines. The factories in the Urals were producing the weapons. The Partisans were ensuring those weapons reached the front, while German supplies never did. Together, they formed a strategic vice that was slowly crushing the Wehrmacht. July 1943. Operation Citadel, Hitler's last major offensive on the Eastern Front, aimed at the Kursk salient. This bulge in the Soviet lines looked temptingly vulnerable. Hitler believed his new weapons, Tiger and Panther tanks, would restore German technological superiority and turn the tide. The German bet was simple. The Tiger, with its 88mm gun and nearly impenetrable frontal armor, could destroy any Soviet tank at a range. The Panther, faster and more reliable, would lead the breakthrough. Together, they would shatter Soviet defenses and encircle hundreds of thousands of troops. But Marshal Zhukov knew the attack was coming. Soviet intelligence had penetrated the German high command. A spy codenamed Werther provided exact details: the date, the location, even the time of the assault. Zhukov used that information to build a fortress. The Soviets constructed defensive lines with anti-tank ditches, minefields, and deep belts of barbed wire. They pulled in troops and tanks from across the front. By the eve of battle, the Germans were outnumbered 5-1. They just didn't know it yet. The assault began on July 5th. Just as German troops prepared to attack, Soviet artillery opened up. A massive barrage that caught the Germans completely off guard. Even so, the Panzers rolled forward the next morning. This time, there would be no lightning breakthrough. The Soviets were dug in, waiting. German tanks drove into kill zones where every approach was covered by anti-tank guns. The advance measured in meters, not kilometers. In the north, the German army gained 6 miles in a week. The cost, 25,000 men and over 200 tanks destroyed. In the south, they did slightly better. A 25-mile wedge driven into Soviet defenses. But it cost them 10,000 men and 350 tanks. Then Zhukov threw in his reserves. On July 12th, 900 Soviet tanks charged into the German flank near Prokhorovka. Almost 2,000 tanks engaged in the largest armored battle of World War II. The Soviet T-34s drove straight into the German lines and opened fire at point-blank range. This negated the Tiger's advantage. At close range, even a T-34 could penetrate its armor. The battle lasted a single day. When it ended, the Germans had lost another 350 tanks and were retreating. The production advantage was now overwhelming. The Soviets lost 1,500 tanks at Kursk. They replaced them in 6 weeks. The Germans lost 760 tanks. It took them 6 months to rebuild their armored forces, and by then, they were needed elsewhere. This was the verdict of the Urals factories. Magnitogorsk had forged the steel. Nizhny Tagil had built the tanks. Uralmash had produced the self-propelled guns that broke German positions. The industrial miracle had created a wall of steel that the Wehrmacht could not break through. After Kursk, Germany never launched another major offensive on the Eastern Front. The strategic initiative had shifted permanently. The Wehrmacht was now fighting a defensive war against an enemy that could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. Soviet factories produced 2,000 tanks per month. German factories produced 500. Every month, the gap widened. Every battle, the Soviet advantage grew. The war would grind on for 2 more years, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The factories had built the weapon that would destroy Nazi Germany, and they had paid for it in blood. April 1945. 2.5 million Soviet troops converge on Berlin, 6,250 tanks, 7,500 aircraft, 16,000 artillery pieces, more guns than the entire German army possessed at this point in the war. This was the final delivery from the Urals factories. Everything built in the snow, forged in the cold, assembled by workers who never lived to see this moment. It all converged on Hitler's capital. The final offensive began with an artillery barrage that lasted 48 hours. 16,000 guns reduced Berlin to rubble before a single Soviet soldier crossed the city limits. The sound could be heard 100 miles away. Survivors described it as the earth itself screaming. The Germans fought with desperate ferocity. Hitler Youth, old men, wounded soldiers, anyone who could hold a weapon was thrown into the battle. But they were fighting with weapons from 1941. The Soviets were fighting with the industrial output of 4 years of total war production. The human cost was staggering, even in victory. 80,000 Soviet soldiers died taking Berlin. After 4 years of war, after Stalingrad and Kursk, after pushing the Germans back across 1,000 miles, lives were still being spent like currency in the final days. The total ledger of Soviet sacrifice defies comprehension. 27 million Soviet dead, military and civilian combined. That includes those 500,000 to 1 million who died in the factories, though they're rarely counted separately. They're just part of the vast ocean of Soviet losses. The German perspective, recorded in Albert Speer's memoir, finally acknowledged what they'd refused to admit during the war. We were outproduced 10 to 1 by 1944. We had better tanks, better training, better tactics. None of it mattered. The war was mathematically lost. Soviet tank production from 1941 to 1945 totaled 105,000 units. Germany produced 67,000, including all variants. The production race had been over since 1943. The Wehrmacht had been fighting a mathematically unwinnable war for 2 years. The question that haunted the post-war years was never asked officially. Did the sacrifice justify the victory? Soviet historians said yes, without hesitation. Dissidents whispered a different question. At what price? Stalin never publicly honored the Urals factory workers. Their sacrifice remained classified. Their stories buried in archives that wouldn't open for decades. The official narrative celebrated heroic soldiers and brilliant generals. The workers who made it all possible were ghosts. When Soviet forces finally raised the red flag over the Reichstag on May 2nd, 1945, it marked the end of the most brutal conflict in human history. The factories had delivered the weapons that won the war, but the cost of that victory would echo through Soviet society for generations. The lie. General Winter saved Moscow. The truth. 1,500 factories, 16 million people evacuated, 500,000 to 1 million workers dead, and a logistics miracle no one talks about. The final image is simple. A T-34 rolling through Red Square in the Victory Parade of 1945, built in a factory with no roof, by a woman who never saw her children again, forged from steel, produced by teenagers who froze to death at their workstations. That tank, and the millions of lives it cost, won World War II. Not the snow, not the cold, steel and blood. If you want to understand how logistics and industrial capacity decided the war, watch this next. Subscribe for more untold stories that challenge what you think you know about history.